KFSR at CMAC present the Central Valley Ledger, a public affairs program featuring stories from all over the Central Valley with Sevag Tateosian, 90.7 KFSR.
Welcome to another edition of the Central Valley Ledger. We're recording via Skype. Thank you to our friends in Skype. We still haven't made it back to the studio yet. My understanding is that soon we'll be recording live in the studio. But, you know, our guest is a very special guest this morning. His name is Arturo Sarukhan. He's actually Ambassador Sarukhan, former ambassador of Mexico to the U.S. He served in that role for many years, I believe 6 years, correct, Ambassador?
That's correct.
Welcome to the program.
My pleasure, Sevag. Thank you for having me.
So I first met you years and years ago in Fresno. You were actually here in Fresno, and we had an opportunity to meet. And at the time, you met with several people in the community. Do you remember that trip? And take us back to memory lane.
Yeah, of course. It was part of my constant travels across the U.S. I can pride myself of having, during my 6 years in office, having visited 45 states in an official capacity at least once. California was a state that I traveled many times in the year too, and obviously I went to Fresno. First of all, because we have a very big immigrant community there that works in the ag sector in the area, but also for personal reasons, because my paternal family are Armenians, and we have friends and family in Fresno, and it was sort of a pilgrimage also to visit another part of my history and my background, which is my Armenian roots.
Let's talk a little bit about your background. So I want you to explain it, but basically your family was refugees from different parts of the world into Mexico. And I want to talk a little bit more about that after you explain a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I was born in Mexico. I carry a Mexican passport. I'm a career ambassador in the Mexican Foreign Service, now on leave from government service. My father's, both my families, paternal and maternal, are refugees in Mexico. On my father's side, Russian Armenians and Armenians. My grandfather was with the Kerensky government, and when Kerensky lost the civil war to Lenin in 1917, he had to flee. He had been trained, he was a Russian Armenian. He had been trained at the very important, famous Armenian seminar in Venice, and he went back to Venice. And my grandmother was an Armenian citizen of the Ottoman Empire when the genocide started in 1915. The family was rounded up. They were shot. She survived. The bullet grazed her forehead. She survived. Soldiers thought she was dead. She and a sister and an uncle and one of the grandparents were able to go to Greece. Greek fishermen helped them get across. Then she went to Venice, and my grandparents met in Venice. And when Mussolini came to power, my grandparents knew that they had to leave, and they came to Mexico. And on my mother's side, they fled Spain in 1939 after the defeat of the Spanish Republic by Franco and the fascist regime that won the Civil War. And they arrived in Mexico in 1939. So in many ways, I think that is a very important reason as to why I decided, I think early on when I was a young adult, that I wanted to dedicate my life to public service in Mexico, and chose the Foreign Service because it was in many ways sort of a measure of giving back to the country that allowed both my families to restart fresh and flee persecution and death.
When I talk to people, I try to explain that, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're the expert here, but from what I've read and what I've observed, Mexico over the years has allowed people in to seek refuge. I mean, you have a population of Lebanese, you have a population of Armenian, you have other populations. And so that's my message I tell people when I meet them, is that, you know, Mexico has been a country that traditionally throughout the years has allowed people in. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's been an often on story. Mexico has had a very important tradition of asylum and refugee. That's how my family's arrived. Many Central European Jews, when they were denied entry by the United States right before the Second World War, came to Mexico. That's how we got our Ashkenazi community in Mexico in the mid-late 1930s. Obviously, the Spanish Republicans, Mexico brought in 200,000 Spanish Republican refugees fleeing the aftermath of the defeat of the Republic. In the 60s, 70s, during the series of military coups in South America, in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Brazil, Mexico, brought in a lot of asylum seekers from those countries. And then in the late 80s and early 90s, it gave residence and Mexican nationality to 1.1 million Guatemalans who had fled the civil war in Guatemala that had raged during the late 80s. Now, unfortunately, Mexico has not been as visionary and as generous as I think it should when it comes to Central American refugees fleeing violence, particularly in Honduras and in El Salvador. But Mexico, certainly the policies of refugee and asylum have been an important mainstay of Mexican diplomacy for at least most of the 20th century, as part of a very important sort of policy and philosophy in terms of those rights and Mexico's obligations internationally to instruments and treaties that it's part of.
I want to talk about what's going on in the United States today. You're in the United States right now. Tell me a little bit about what your thoughts are. I mean, how are things going in the United States, or what's happening in the United States?
Well, I must say that I'm concerned. I'm concerned as someone who has spent all his diplomatic career working with and engaging with the United States. I'm what you call in diplomatic parlance a U.S. hand, which means that I've dedicated most of my diplomatic career to relations with the United States. I spent 6 years as ambassador to the United States during the last 2 years of the Bush administration and the first full 4 of the Obama administration. I was consul general of Mexico in New York City. I was here as a junior diplomat in the embassy when we negotiated NAFTA in 1993. So this is a country that I know extremely well. My wife is American. My 2 daughters were born in the United States, which is one of the reasons why I think I decided to stay after I left government service. And I have to confess, I am worried. I think the fraying of civility, of democratic institutions, this huge polarization, ideological, even tribal, that exists today in the United States is of great concern. And the problem is, and here I may wade into partisan politics, but the problem is that you have a flamethrower in the White House. Just look at what has happened with the terrible tragedy of the assassination of George Floyd, and at moments where you need a president who will calm the nation and speak to the nation and unite the nation, speak to our better angels, if you like, is further polarizing in this us versus them narrative, which I think is so dangerous. But at the same time, Sevag, I think it would be a mistake to think that Trump is the disease and not the symptom. He is president because there is something much more structural happening in the United States today, where the middle, the center, that center that allowed people to exchange ideas, to debate, even though they had different points of view, to listen to one another. People are now increasingly politically and ideologically and philosophically living in silos, and they filter out anything that doesn't comport to their worldview. And this is creating, I think, very dangerous cleavages in American society today. We're seeing it on the streets of many cities in the United States in these very important demonstrations against police violence and police brutality against blacks and other minorities. So as someone who has studied the US for most of my life, who was born in a country that shares a 3,000-kilometer border with the United States, that has 11 million Mexicans living in the United States, and the US has 1.5 million Americans living permanently in Mexico. It is worrying, and I think that as you look around the globe at a moment of great dislocation because of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, U.S. leadership is sorely needed, and it's nowhere to be found.
Let's talk a little bit about U.S. and Mexico relations. You gave the numbers of how many Mexicans live in the United States, and vice versa. I think sometimes we don't remember that we have Americans living in Mexico. They're living there, they're working there.
It's the largest U.S. expat community living in any country in the world. It lives in Mexico. 1.5 million Americans live permanently in Mexico.
I have friends that have family in Mexico, that have property in Mexico. They love visiting. And, you know, the Mexican Americans and Mexicans play such an important role in the United States. Can you talk about U.S.-Mexico relations and why it's so important to have good relations on both sides?
Look, it's not going to come as a surprise because of my background and what I've done for most of my life, but I don't think there is a more important relationship with the United States than the one it has with Mexico. Yes, it's true that relations with China and Russia and the Middle East and Israel are critically important and tend to hog the bandwidth of U.S. attention when it looks at the world. But if you measure the daily impact that Mexico has on the security, well-being, prosperity of America and of Americans, there's no more important bilateral relationship. We trade. Mexico is the United States' largest trading partner, Sevag. We trade 1.5 billion with a B. Wow. $1.5 billion a day of trade go back and forth across our border on every single day. 28 states in the United States have Mexico as their number one trading partner. Mexico is the second largest buyer after Canada of U.S. exports. And to give your listeners and your viewers a sense of what being the second largest buyer of U.S. export looks like, let me give you some comparisons. Mexico today buys more U.S. exports than all of Latin America and the Caribbean nations combined. Or to give you another regional example, Mexico buys more U.S. exports than China and Japan put together. Or Mexico buys more U.S. exports than the four so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Or now that the UK has finally, or is now formally leaving the European Union, Mexico buys more U.S. exports than all of the European Union nations put together. This is a whopping amount of trade, of economic and trade connectivity between our two countries. If you think of security, post 9/11, Mexico and the United States started working hand in hand to ensure that Mexico would not be used because of the porous nature of the border, because how difficult it is to ensure that no one crosses that border illegally, which happens frequently, to ensure that that border was not used by a potential terrorist seeking to undermine U.S. security. And the fact is that since 9/11, there hasn't been a single incident of a terrorist operating on U.S. soil against the interests of the United States that would have crossed the border from Mexico, because both countries, along with Canada, by the way, have been working to ensure that North America is secure. And for example, what does this mean? Again, so your viewers can understand. Since 9/11, Mexico and the United States share the passenger lists of every single aircraft that flies into Mexican airspace.
Wow.
to ensure that there's no one on that airplane that either is on a watch list or has been previously denied a visa to enter the United States. And we do that with Canada, with the United States, and with Mexico. So think of water resources, the Rio Grande and the Colorado River, which are so important for farmers and for communities on both sides of the border. How we manage those water resources at a time where both the Colorado River Basin and the Rio Grande Basin are being affected by severe drought patterns because of climate change. Think of the social connectivity between both sides of the border. Many people tend to forget that if you turn the 4 US border states and the 6 Mexican border states into one single country, they would be the 5th largest economy in the world.
Incredible.
And these border states, if you look at them, in many ways are much more similar to one another than they are to Washington, D.C. or Mexico City. What has been happening in these border states is that there is a great economic and social convergence. Boy Scouts clubs and soccer clubs and rotaries and people coming back and forth. We have 1 million legal border crossings on any given day between both Mexico and the United States. It is the busiest land border on the face of the earth. We've got 42 ports of entry. Again, 1 million people cross the border both directions every day with papers, legal crossings. And we have 75,000 trucks delivering goods crossing our border every single day. So just imagine the dynamics of these flows. And the challenge for policymakers in Washington and in Mexico City is how do we ensure that this very dynamic trans-border flow works like sort of a membrane. A membrane in biology, what does a membrane do? It filters the bad stuff out and lets the good stuff through. That's what our border mechanisms seek to do, to allow that trade and that commerce and those flows of communities and people across the border while ensuring that the bad actors cannot get through. And so it is an extremely dynamic relationship. It is a relationship where the success of one nation means the success for the other. And I'm not even going into what it means for the US in terms of the huge contributions that the Mexican and Mexican American community, remember there are 35 million Mexican Americans living in the United States, the contributions that these individuals make to the well-being, prosperity, and security of the United States on any given day.
You know what's interesting to me is that you don't hear in the media or in the reports what you just told me. You only hear about the stuff that's going to catch attention. And I hate to put it that way, but 1 million people daily crossing legally anywhere is an important and large number. Do you think that the media sometimes plays into the hype here and wants you to hear what it is, that's going to get your attention? Because the trucks you mentioned that come daily, the trade that you mentioned that the U.S. does into Mexico, we hardly ever hear about that stuff.
Yeah, let me use this metaphor to sort of explain why I think you're on point. You've got, well, you don't now because of what is happening with COVID, but on any given day, you've got thousands of flights taking off from, hundreds of airports around the world. You never read stories about this. The moment you have one accident, it's all over the front pages of the news. And there's another dynamic which sort of I think also impacts, which is if it bleeds, it leads. And these two sort of trends tend to dominate the way news are processed and disseminated. So yes, a lot of these good news and the very complex dynamics of managing this joint border in both directions, where every single day you've got millions of crossings of merchandise and people where nothing happens and they're secure, and it is a testament to the edifice that Mexico and the United States have built as partners since 1993, when NAFTA entered into force, and which we hope will continue to be augmented and expanded now that the renegotiated USMCA comes into force on July 1st.
Let's talk a little bit about COVID-19 or the coronavirus. We're engulfed in coronavirus stuff. My day job is at the health department, making sure that, our provider lines and our investigation teams are staffed with people that can track and trace COVID-19 stuff. In Mexico, are we seeing a big impact of COVID-19 as we're seeing here and around the world?
Yes, Mexico will not escape the huge social and economic dislocations that COVID-19 is triggering. And again, because of our 3,000 contiguous land border, the connectivity, both in epidemiological terms, but also in terms of economic impact, will create huge challenges for both countries. That's why, for example, trying to align our supply chains and what we designated as essential sectors on either side of the border needed to be as symmetrical as possible, because as you slowly start firing up the economies of both countries, because we are now producing goods together, those supply chains are critically important for our economic restart and ramp up. But the public health effects are extremely important. They've been devastating in the United States. They're being devastated in Mexico. Mexico is now very close to the peak of contagions. We entered the spike in cases later than the United States, but Mexico, particularly Mexico City, is now in very close to the peak moment of contagion. And you've seen some of the dynamics that unfortunately you saw here in the United States early on, where President Trump sort of seemed to deny that there was such a thing as a pandemic when he suggested that this was an invention of the media and the Democrats trying to scupper his chances of re-election. Well, President López Obrador in Mexico, in many ways, has been singing the same tune. He until very late in March, he was still hugging babies and kissing babies and doing tours around the country. He persists in not using a face mask. He's now restarted his trips across the country, minimizing. Many would say there's been even an undercount of cases in Mexico. But certainly what we're seeing now, what worries me is that whereas the curve in the US had started to fall, we're seeing some spikes, particularly in California and Texas, two border states with Mexico. Mexico is on the way up to its spike and its peak moment. So we could see a renewed spike in cases. And that's not even mentioning what we could see in the autumn and winter months ahead of us this year, when it's obvious we will see a renewed peak. Mexico has lost more than 400 Mexicans, particularly in the New York City metropolitan area. We've got a big Mexican community that lives in New York City. About 1.2 million Mexicans live in the tri-state metropolitan area. So we've got very, very important cases in the US of Mexicans too. And again, because of this connectivity, social and economic between both countries, the fact that we're seeing a new spike in the US, the fact that we're reaching peak contagion phase in Mexico, makes me a bit concerned as to what the next weeks or month could look like in terms of numbers on the border with Mexico and inside Mexico.
We're running out of time this week on the program. I can sit and talk to you for hours and hours and days and days. What is it you're doing these days? How can we as a community help you? By the way, I still one day want to bring you to Fresno again, so that's still on the plans. But how can we help you in whatever it is that you're doing now?
Well, look, I've been doing. I have a consulting firm in DC since I left public service. It's basically consulting for businesses doing that have a footprint in Mexico or Latin American businesses in the United States. But beyond that, I think I'm very concerned, Sevag, that a country like the U.S. that was built by immigrants and because of immigration you're starting. Forget about the nativist rhetoric coming out of the White House. You're starting to see, and particularly accelerated because of COVID, this sort of us, them, refugees and migrants as potential sources of contagion. I'm very worried about what this will do to policies that have to do with refugee and asylum in the United States. One of the reasons why we have such a vital Armenian community in California, thanks to those historical policies that have allowed this country to be built and enriched by the lives of so many migrants. And I am concerned that we need to push back against this xenophobia. I understand the concerns that about legality in the processes of accessing whether it's U.S. visas or opportunities in the U.S. But the U.S. can't turn its back on its DNA. It's, e pluribus unum, out of many one, isn't just a motto on a seal. It's the essence of this country. And I hope that together, Latinos and Blacks and whites and everyone, minorities and Asian Americans in this country, can make the case as to why immigration is not a source of threat to the well-being and security of the United States. It's what makes this country strong. And I think that we need to continue to make this case in the coming weeks and months.
Mr. Ambassador, very well said. Thank you for educating the audience a little bit about Mexican and American relations, and really what I've said all along, a strong Mexico and a strong United States is good for bilateral relations.
A rising tide lifts boats on both sides of the border, Sevag.
Exactly. Thank you, sir, and you have yourself a great one.
Have a good one, and thank you for having me.
KFSR and CMAC present the Central Valley Ledger every Sunday morning at 11:30. For a complete program schedule, visit kfsr.org.